Welcome.
Hi, everybody. Welcome so much to our next Speaking of Schools installment. For those of you who are familiar with Save Our Schools Arizona Network, you know that we have been running a series of Speaking of Schools conversations this summer. And we have been fortunate enough to talk to people from our state, lawmakers, policymakers, teachers. We are also talking to national experts. And so I'm super excited to introduce you to Derek Black. And he is a professor of law at the University of South Carolina. And he's one of the nation's foremost experts in education law and policy. And Beth and I met him several years ago and have been learning from him ever since. And he has long been an outspoken advocate of the importance of public education. His research focuses on something that's near and dear to many of us, and that is school funding and equality for disadvantaged students. He's also, his research appears in the nation's top legal journals. So we're very fortunate to have him with us today. And perhaps most exciting is that he has a book coming out in the fall called Schoolhouse Burning: Public Education and the Assault on American Democracy. And I know that that's something that's near and dear to many of our hearts. And so we are very thrilled to have Derek Black with us today. Welcome, Derek.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So let's just start with a quick question. I think I'm very fascinated because my background is also in academics, and I'm fascinated in your legal career because when someone goes to law school, there's so many different things that you can do with a law degree. So tell us how it is that you got so interested in particular in public education and why that became your scholarly focus.
Yeah. Well, before I do that, I should say, what a pleasure it is to be with you. I mean, Beth, I didn't put her on the spot, but she said, "Do you remember me?" She's, when I met them, when I was in Indianapolis a couple of years ago, I was awestruck. I showed up and I was like, "Here's all these people, and I've seen these people, in my newspaper and whatnot back home, and they're mostly women primarily." And I was like, I know this person, and ultimately it was just really a special moment for me to see all of these folks from around the nation coming, and of course, Save Our Schools Arizona being core part and galvanizing part of that, and I'll read a little bit later from my book, but I was telling Sharon before, you guys are on page 23. I don't know if any of you know who that is. I don't know who that. Do you guys know? Anyway, it's there were a couple of different Arizona State Capitol pictures there, and that's the one that that looked best. There were some that showed you could see far more of you together, but this one, the masses of faces don't show up so well in books sometimes. Yeah. So, in any event, so you guys are part of my story as well. But your question was about sort of law school and education, and I guess the prologue of my book tells a little bit about my story, but not the specific one that you asked. So the short story is, I thought I was going to go to get a PhD. Well, I should say, I grew up thinking, oh, a lawyer would be a cool thing to be. And then once I got a little bit of better sense of myself in college, I thought, who wants to be a lawyer? So then I was going to go get a PhD in history or something. And then at some point I sort of figured out that law school had a lot of overlap with my interest. I'd gotten involved with some student activism around issues of race and ethnicity in college. And I figured out that, that sort of intersection of law and race, civil rights was there. So I chose where I went to law school really based upon the particular courses they offer, which is not how most people choose law school. They just look at U.S. News, World, and Report and pick whatever's the highest. But so I went to University of North Carolina. It really was between UNC and UCLA. They had, from my perspective, the two strongest civil rights curriculum. And so I went there. And, at some point your job, that sort of civil rights was an amorphous concept. And sometimes your job finds you as much as you find it. But my first internship was at the Office for Civil Rights of the Department of Education. That was during the Clinton administration. And so the rest is kind of history. I won't bore you with the details, but that's sort of how I went in that direction. But it's always been a tremendous overlap with teachers and schools of education because the typical lawyer, they may just litigate based upon what happened, so to speak, and the law. Whereas everything that I've ever done has always been a combination of not just what happened, but what does social science, what does the data about schools, what does the research tell you?
I am. I want to tell everybody that you are an amazing follow on Twitter too. So if you follow Derek at Derek W. Black, his take on current education issues and what's going on right now with DeVos and vouchers is spot on. And you recently wrote an op-ed in the USA Today, I think, that we spread to our readers. And just overall, your writing is impeccable, but you really come at this work from a civil rights lens. And I know that we at Save Our Schools really appreciate that. And, we're seeing the detrimental effects here in Arizona too.
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, it feels good to hear you say that. Although sometimes I feel like I'm a one-trick pony because it's the same thing every day. It feels like, which is, Betsy DeVos said this, and that's stupid, and so here's why it's stupid. So, but in any event, yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that's been interesting that I've found, obviously being able to follow what other folks are doing on Twitter, but just making the connections between people that just didn't exist a decade ago in the academy. It's like I feel like I've met more advocates, more scholars, more reporters through Twitter than I ever did, by picking up the phone and calling someone 10 years.
You start to realize that there are so many of us out there who really care, who really get it, and people are really connecting the dots around, vouchers and privatization and in a whole new way because of voices like yours. So thank you. And I'm very excited to read your new book. So Schoolhouse Burning, Public Education and the Assault on American Democracy. It's coming out this fall, I believe. And we'd love to hear a little preview and maybe some key takeaways that you.
Yeah. Well, so let me read a little bit. I actually dedicated the book to my high school, Clinton, Tennessee, and the teachers there. And so I always, anytime I get a chance, to thank teachers for the work that you guys do. And I think, this is the prologue. It isn't really the substance of the book, but I think it tells you a little bit about where I'm coming from and then give you a little bit of sense of where it goes. But so this sort of starts out by saying, my path to this book was an unlikely one. All told, my family accumulated more GEDs than college diplomas, which is to say we had a few GEDs and not any college degrees before me. And the only thing that I really had pointing my way towards college was the general undefined idea that I should go. Knowing what I know now and thinking about my family's background, I would have never placed a bet on me. I won't get into the nitty gritty of the demographics of my family, but I switched schools 4 times by the 7th grade. And losing friends and the anxiety of making new ones made each school new and more intimidating than the last one. A few low grades here and there, coupled with referral for speech therapy, made my progress far from sure. And, I can still see myself sitting next to the window in 2nd grade, waiting for my turn to read aloud to come. The other students, at least from my perspective, seemed to ease through their parts. But the fear inside of me definitely welled up as my turn neared. I think I managed the words correctly, but I just wanted to get through. That was the only thing. And even to this day, a swirling of thoughts and emotions remain with me when I wait to speak amongst a group of people. So how was it that I made it to college, took up African American studies as a major, excelled in law school, interned at the Office for Civil Rights, litigated school desegregation cases at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, founded the Education Rights Center at Howard, and then went on to do a little bit of work for the Obama transition team. No doubt, my parents were hardworking, and my grandparents' overwhelming love and support and stability doubled my relatively low chances. But much of everything else hinged on the opportunity that public education afforded me. And the key being sometimes when I didn't even want it for myself. I can't count how many decisions teachers and administrators made to keep me on track and to clear the path of opportunity. And I can't count them because they made them without me or my parents knowing. Judged against today's sense of transparency and autonomy, most parents would think that is the worst thing they've ever heard. But as you all certainly know, schools can't run everything by their parents. And we, as the quote unquote outsiders, have to trust them to make some well informed judgments themselves. And in theory, their judgments can make all the difference in the world for a kid. At the very least, they did for me. And I sort of skipped several pages about my school. And I talked a little bit about sort of my civil rights practice, but getting to the heart of the book and my research, I said the real breakthrough in my research occurred when I stopped looking forward and I gazed backwards instead, almost by accident. And what I found was a historical commitment to the constitutional right to education that, while lost for a long period, is almost impossible for the modern mind to believe. It stretches back to the earliest days of this nation and was reborn with even more vigor following the Civil War. The goals that the nation set during those times are humbling on so many different levels. However progressive we may think we are today, our forefathers have us beat in spades when it comes to education. You think an adequate education is a modern idea? Think again. You think the NAACP dreamt up integrated schools in the 1950s? Think again. You think the concerns with voter education and the corruption of the political process started with Donald Trump? Think again. You think the challenges in providing adequate school funding is a modern problem? Think again. And because these problems aren't new, the nation came up with solutions long ago that can still work today if we trust our roots. And matched against the history that we think we know, our forgotten history is so powerfully unsettling that it has the capacity to completely reorient the way we see our schools and democracy. And if we could do that, who knows what's possible? I know the public education I received rested on decisions that people made for communities like mine well before I ever set foot on this earth. Those decisions, in many instances, were the result of pitched fights over how to better our schools and democracy as a whole. And most of those fights began in the 1800s and reverberated during times of cultural strife for the next 2 centuries. Public education is, in effect, the inheritance that we all share, and one that is crucially important for kids like me who never could have hoped for an inheritance in the literal sense. And this book is about safeguarding and nurturing that inheritance for future generations. What follows in the book is my best effort to tell the education story and tell it in a way that's relevant to the challenges that our kids and our schools face today: poverty, inequality, and public education system under siege. So that's just sort of the introduction. Then the book ends up, sort of starting with the current crisis, and certainly talk about and mention Arizona and lots of other places. I talk about the DeVos appointment. I talk about the way that we've changed, or people are trying to change the way that we talk about education. So I take a snapshot of what's the current discussion about education, what's the current status of funding, what's the current status of charter schools, what's the current status of vouchers, and then inequality. And then I rewind back to 1787 and tell a story. And I use that story from 1787 through about 2000 to say, how well are we doing if we measure ourselves against where we were and where we've come? And a couple of things come out of that. One is we're doing terribly in a lot of ways today. But, I found over the course of writing the book some really important silver linings, and I'm a silver lining type of guy, so you have to be suspicious of me in that respect. But when we recommitted, or actually first fully committed to a system of public schools for everyone, of all race, sex, and gender following the Civil War, during Reconstruction, that began to take hold. But then, of course, we all know the story of Jim Crow, where schools were resegregated and funding attacks on them. But there was this moment in time where the former slaveholders wanted to do away with education. And what had happened was that both African Americans and poor whites who were getting something that they had never gotten before said, wait a minute, even the poor whites, we may not be crazy about African Americans, but this public education, that's a pretty good thing, and we want to hold on to it. So the choice was made to segregate public education, not to do away with it. If you move forward to desegregation in the 1960s, that same choice came again when Virginia, the state of Virginia said, we'll just close public schools altogether. We'll just voucherize the system and keep kids segregated. And ironically enough, it was white suburban families in Richmond, Virginia that said, not so sure about that. If our choice is between no public education and some form of integrating education, we'll take integrated education. And so part of the story I also tell is that it is the tie that binds us together. It's never been perfect and never will be fully perfect. But it has always been an approximation of us trying to reach our highest ideals. And it has stuck. It has stuck and has weathered the storm. And the thing that I point out in the book that's different this time is that previously the attacks on education were purely for some racial end that the leaders knew well enough, don't attack education just for the sake of attacking it. That's not a good idea. You need a racial wedge if you're going to do this. But what's different this time is that actually they're going for everyone's education, which is a far more radical idea, or at least as radical as we've seen before. But at the same time, the public opinion polling still stands incredibly strong. For those of you who didn't see it, the national PDK or Phi Delta, I don't know, whatever PDK stands for, the Kaplan surveys they do every year actually showed that parents, so there was two questions. One, to teachers, what percentage of you would support going on strike for underfunded schools? I think it was like 65% of the teachers said that. But when they asked the parents, how many of you would support teachers if they went on strike because the schools were underfunded? It was like 80 some odd percent, incredible number. And, I also talk about in the book, even in the South, in the deep South, there was a survey done demographically and politically representative across all the southeastern states. And what they found, or what I saw in that data, was that only 3 or 4 percentage points on these various questions about equality and funding, only 3 or 4 percentage points separated Republicans from Democrats. It's like, the support for public education was in, the 80s every time for both parties. And so that's the irony of today, which is that data confirms my sense of what the public feels about public education. But there's this small minority, as you know very well in Arizona, this small minority of powerful people who are really raging against the rest of society, right? Trying to pursue their own limited ends. So in any event, I try to put all this in historical and modern context as well. But I'll stop talking there. I got a little long-winded. I'll turn it back over.
Well, I want to just jump in and say a couple of things. I'm really struck by the fact that you start with a story of your own experience, because I think that's representative of so many people, the way that our public education made such enormous differences in our lives and the trajectory of our lives and our careers, the way we raise our children and educate our children. It's just so important to so many people. And then the other thing that you said that really struck me that I haven't thought about is, these battles over public education have gone on for a long time. And so often, race was the sort of defining breaking point in a way. And now it's become even more radical than that. And we now see attacks on our public education system coming from so many different corners, and mostly from very well-funded special interest groups is what we see in Arizona. So I just, that's just a couple of comments, just sort of based on what, on your comments earlier.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, and I haven't fully sorted through it in my own mind, because it's more of an observation than something I could prove. But, you know, when you sort of follow this historical arc of public education and you think about high water marks, so, you know, all high water marks produce a backlash. So if Reconstruction following the Civil War is a high water mark, then right, obviously Jim Crow is a reaction to that. If you look at a case that many of you probably wouldn't be familiar with following Brown versus Board of Education, there's a case called Green versus New Kent County, and there's another one called Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg. One of those is in Charlotte, and the other is was actually in the Voucher district up in Virginia. But that produces a backlash, and a national backlash, right? It produces a backlash that reaches all the way to the presidential office, which then changes the judiciary. I tell that story about how, you know, President Nixon specifically chooses his first three appointments to the Supreme Court to make sure that they reverse not Roe versus Wade, but Green, you know, Swan and Brown, that, you know, that the party is done with integration, and lots of other details to go with that. The funny thing that happens, though, is that the right to education splits off from school desegregation during that period, and you see as soon as school desegregation starts to fade, this sort of school funding thing continues. The first school funding lawsuits were filed in the early 70s. Of course, San Antonio versus Rodriguez, the big federal case that loses, but the state cases were going at the same time, California, New Jersey, and elsewhere. And those cases, you know, they don't have big success. There's a couple of wins, so you're sort of bobbing around with, you know, mixed success from 70s until about, you know, the late 80s, early 90s, and all of a sudden Kentucky hits, you know, with this case Rose, and where they recognize in Kentucky that this right to an adequate education. And after that decision in Rose, that line of the right to education and school funding, which had just sort of survived flatline following Brown, shoots off like a rocket, and people start winning 75, 80% of the time. And if you look at that period of time between, you know, early 90s and the beginning of the last recession, I mean, it was gangbusters for school funding litigation and the enforcement of the right to education. I mean, they have won 28 times in the state of New Jersey, right? And until a bad case in about 2006, you know, Arizona had won a number of cases, at least on the ELL and federal court. So in any event, the thing that's a long-winded way of saying, I do believe that part of this modern charter and voucher movement is actually a response to the fact that for a good solid 15, 20 years, it really looked like the right to education and equal and adequate resources was going to be here to stay. And that put an enormous amount of pressure on state houses to meet those obligations. And a lot of people don't want to. So I do see that the vouchers and the charters are in part, or at least potentially in part, a response to how much headway was made on the right to education between, you know, 1990 and 2008. And then the recession just creates an excuse, right? It just creates an excuse to sort of stop that movement and then in fact begin to undermine it in many respects.
Well, and we in our research have seen, you know, that in the South after Brown versus Board, that the segregation academies led to obviously a lot of white flight, but that also led to this sort of shifting of responsibility where local taxpayers didn't really want to fund public schools anymore. And that has sort of been reflected in Arizona as well. And I'm wondering about other states. I mean, Here, we did win a few cases for school funding, but our local tax base has been shrunk so much over the last 25 years that even by the Great Recession, we were already 47th in the nation in funding.
Yeah, I mean, you guys, unfortunately, are an exception, I think, to that general story, and charters hit, Arizona before the recession, right? I mean, President Bush was cheerleading a couple of these places and house in Gilbert and whatnot, very early on, right? So, they're ahead of the curve there, and I think for ethnic and other reasons, there's always been the challenge of funding. But your point about how race and ethnicity connects with funding is right. In fact, another article that I'm researching, I'm going to start this fall, is trying to explore, and I think this is correct, trying to explore the extent to which local taxation as a concept actually grows out of racial conflict itself. Like if you would have told me that 3 years ago, I would have said, yeah, that sounds like something that some liberal like myself or someone else would make up, but it's not really true. Like, it sounds like the thing you say, but it's not true. But in the course of researching this book, I came across a couple of things. And then I also read a book by Camille Walsh. I think she's at the University of Washington. She's a tax person. I read her book, and I came across a couple of things in my book that said, wait a minute, maybe that's right. Because one of the things in my book is saying, look, there's a lot of this history that just gets buried because of Jim Crow, for number one. And if things get buried long enough, people just forget them and assume, well, that's just the way things have been. Schools have always been segregated. As just an example, I always tell my law students, that's actually not true. In 1874 or 76, the law school class at the University of South Carolina, the sort of, the bed of Confederacy, was racially mixed, right? It was like the first year, it was like there's classes were small back then. It was like 5 African Americans and 7, white students that year. And 2 years later, African Americans were actually the majority of the incoming class at the University of South Carolina. There's a beautiful letter from a student who was at Howard University, and he writes a letter home to his mother in South Carolina and says, "Mom, I'm coming home to finish my legal degree at the University of South Carolina. I think it has more to offer me than Howard University." Now, if I told you that, well, I'm telling it to you now, he's lying. Like, no, it's true. I read the letter. I couldn't believe it. What does that have to do with taxes? Well, I was telling you that story about how there was this mixed emotion about the right to education following Reconstruction. It had been primarily a movement to extend education for former slaves, but also to whites. And so when the elites took back over, they said, we've got to end education. Well, they figured out they couldn't do that because people were going to rebel. But what they did decide was, if we can push decision making to the local level, then no one can sue the state of South Carolina for discriminating against African Americans. And actually, the tax structure for funding schools changed as a result of what we call the Redemption Constitutional Conventions in the late 1800s. So prior to those conventions, so just so I'm keeping my years straight, between 1868 and let's say 1890, public education in the state of South Carolina and pretty much throughout the South was funded by, get this, statewide poll taxes. African Americans had supported poll taxes because their land wasn't worth much at that point. It was post-war. They said, look, if we want to make sure schools are funded, the way to do it is to have a poll tax. They said, but if you can't pay it, you can still vote. So they didn't actually exclude anyone from, but they generated this pot of money that all went to the state and then got sent back out to the districts. Well, in the Redemption Constitutional Conventions, they said, we don't want statewide funding through poll taxes anymore. We need to flatline the poll taxes or give some local districts the ability to double their poll taxes if they can raise more than other places, and to allow decision making about how to distribute that money to happen at the district level as opposed to the state level. And so if people want to attack, unequal school funding, they're going to have to go one district at a time, which was actually the real challenge that the NAACP LDF confronted, 60 years later, was how do we bring down school desegregation when all these decisions have been pushed to the local level? We cannot sue 10,000 school districts. We need to sue 50 states. But the states they'd already fixed it for themselves, or at least locked it in. So there is that sort of Reconstruction era, and then of course, we see similar things happening again following school desegregation, as people start moving around and trying to cross district lines, really based upon a system that was much earlier, cross district lines so they can hoard resources, and that sort of thing. So fascinating history if you
Wow. That is fascinating history. I think maybe as we're talking about cases and kind of what's going on, trends in vouchers, if we sort of jump to the current day, I think many of our listeners know that in Arizona, we have primarily two kinds of vouchers. We have ESAs, Empowerment Scholarship Accounts, which most other states call Education Savings Account, but it's still the ESA acronym. And that is what Save Our Schools Arizona stopped from becoming universal in our state. We also have STO, School Tuition Organization, tax credit vouchers that fund private school tuition. And Arizona was the first state to have these tax credit vouchers. So we've been giving these since 1998. And now our state spends combined in these two kinds of vouchers over $264 million per year, subsidizing private school education. And in most instances, we know that with the STO vouchers, about 90% of those tax credit vouchers go to religious schools. And most of those are Christian religious schools in our state. So just a couple weeks ago, the Supreme Court issued a ruling in Espinoza versus Montana that deals with these tax credits. Can you tell us a little bit about Espinoza versus Montana and if that impacts Arizona at all?
Well, you said yours was already funding religious schools, right?
Yeah.
So that doesn't affect you directly, but to sort of give you the wide lens on what it matters and how that case matters and what it means. So, the simplest explanation for that case is it does not mandate or require vouchers in a single place in the United States of America, or ESAs or variants. But what it does say is that if you have one of those programs, you cannot exclude religious schools from it. So if you think you're going to run a voucher program and you're only going to extend it to non-religious, organizations, you're wrong. It has to be made available to all of them, which in most states means instead of you're like quadrupling the number of people who can get access, because in most places about 75 or 80% of the private schools are religious. But as you know, a good chunk of the states that already had these, ESAs and vouchers were already allowing religious schools to use them anyway. And so it's only directly affecting a small group of states as a legal matter. Right? So as a legal matter, it certainly matters in those states, but it is not, completely changing the landscape. The big question is, are you going to have vouchers or not? That's question number one. And now, well, there actually is no question after question number one, because it used to be question number two is, well, are you going to allow religious schools to have them? And that's not a question anymore. You cannot choose otherwise. But what I do say, or I said in that USA Today piece, was that, the symbolism of it is enormous. The folks that have been pushing for them, for vouchers, that have been trying to tear down, every wall, every limitation possible. And in some states that don't have robust programs yet or don't have them, and one of the arguments has been, well, we don't want, we're concerned about how this program would operate in terms of religion or not religion. In South Carolina, one of the attacks, I mean, we've got a bill right now that is, it probably would have passed were it not for COVID, but I guess that's one good thing, but that's like the only good thing I can say about COVID. But the session got cut short. But that one, ironically, we have a constitutional clause that prohibits us from funding religious education, but somehow or another, council at the legislature didn't think that precluded them from giving vouchers, so they were going to give it to religious schools anyway. But one of the arguments that the local teachers association, et cetera, had used to push back was to go, wait a minute, this violates the state constitution. That argument against a voucher program just isn't there anymore. So, I think the other thing I think to note about Espinosa and also this movement is, they have always tried to turn this issue around as to saying that they're the ones being discriminated against. So you're discriminating against us because you don't let us have private education, or you're discriminating against us because you let us have private education, but you won't let us have religious private education. And so there's this really sort of victim game that they play, and they won again, right? So that everyone else is the bad guy, and they're, not that picking bad guys is healthy, but in any event, And so now the next frontier, and you go on and watch, the Cato Institute occasionally trolls me and Dr. Preston Green. In fact, they were harassing Preston and Beth too. They were harassing Preston some time ago. And Preston wanted me to get, well, I shouldn't be. Anyway, and I was just like, yeah, just ignore that. And, but sure enough, when I posted this thing about Espinosa, Corey DeAngelos and Neil McCluskey were on there saying, what are you talking about discrimination in private schools, Derek? These private schools aren't going to discriminate, and Section 1981 prohibits, it's a federal anti-discrimination, prohibits discrimination and admissions. And so, you're the law professor, you ought to know that case, Runyon versus McCrary. And so, first of all, they're not lawyers. They think they know a lot more than they do about the Supreme Court and federal discrimination laws. But you don't have to be a lawyer to know or not. It's just they think they know a lot more than they do. But so I didn't want to get in a fight to them, but I don't know if you saw it the other day. There was a little girl wore a Black Lives Matter shirt to her pre-K, and they kicked her out for wearing, the Black Lives Matter shirt. And so I responded. I actually didn't tag Corey in them because I just didn't want to get into it. But I just said, I said, look, here's the explanation for why it is that statute that Corey and them point to doesn't fix everything. Because this private pre-K kicked this little girl out for wearing a BLM, shirt. And I can tell you a public school cannot do that. And a private school can. It is constitutional for them to do that. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 applies to public schools. It does not apply to private schools, at least the ones that don't receive federal funds. The only thing that is protected, I guess, to get to the number, the only thing that is protected by 1981 is the contractual agreement between the school and the student. So it is true that a private school could not say to an African American or Latina child, we are not going to admit you because of your race or ethnicity. That would violate 1981. But they can do everything else that they want to discriminate against. So it's only that sort of enrollment that they don't have to discriminate. And they don't have to recruit you. They don't have to be nice to you. And it's just like they have to let you enroll. And that's it. And no one wants to enroll in some place that's going to kick you out for wearing a BLM shirt. And so anyway, and then of course the issues with LGBTQ youth they're even more vulnerable.
Yes.
And I think women or young women as well vulnerable in numerous ways, and in a private school setting that they wouldn't be in a public school setting.
We've had a lot of parents who receive ESAs here in Arizona for their students with special needs who, receive the voucher, go to a private school, and they're turned away repeat, repeat, right? And it's such a sad story because people kind of think once you receive a voucher, you're guaranteed admission to whatever school. And unfortunately, I mean, I think they typically hear, we just don't provide those services.
Well, and that's another good point. The Cato Institute focuses so much on, well, they can't racially discriminate in that at that moment of contracting, but they can discriminate on every single other basis. So you could be, whatever your demographic background, if you don't have the grades that they're interested in, or you don't have the parental support that they're interested in, or you don't have the transportation that they're interested in, or you don't have the computer that they're in, they can exclude you for all of those reasons, which of course overlap with race and ethnicity. So they don't really have to discriminate based upon race, to produce a relatively monolithic type of environment that they might want. And not just racially monolithic, but monolithic in lots of other demographic areas as well.
So one of the things that interested me about the Montana case is that it was just a $150 tax credit. And so, like I mentioned before, in Arizona, we now have $264 million being drained away from our public schools. So is there any point at which, are there any limits at all in terms of how much money can be drained away when a state is, as in the case of Arizona, responsible for the establishment and maintenance of a general and uniform public school system? So at what point does all that money being drained away actually harm our ability to uphold that responsibility in our state constitution?
Yeah, and so that's, I think you mentioned some reference that you looked at my article. I don't know if you're trying to put yourself to sleep or what, but my article preferencing choice. But what I lay out in that law review article, and it's also part of the narrative, the historical narrative of my book, is to say when these constitutional clauses were created, what they did was make public education the foremost duty of the state. In fact, if you look at most state constitutions, public education is the only thing they actually do have to do. They don't have to have a hospital, they don't have to have health care, they don't have to have police, and you might unelect them if they didn't. But education, that's it, right? That is your one job, right? And that's where 65% of public tax dollars go as it is. And it was that way for a reason. It's part of democracy, it's part of the history. This was all very intentional. And so what I talk about in the book and also in that article is that we have to, what those constitutional clauses establish is sort of a priority system, right? And that public education is always constitutionally priority number one. And that it's not to say, I hate to say it, I'm not saying that you could never have a voucher. I'm not saying you could never have a charter. That's not the argument I make. What I say is that you could never preference those things or fund them in such a way that it undermines education being the state's highest obligation. And so to answer your question, at what point is it problematic? It's problematic, number one, if they're taking the money out of the public school system, and so their revenues are going down. So how could you say that you have public education as your first love when you're taking checks from your first love and giving them to your purported second love, voucher or charter? So that being number one. The other one being at what point does that loss of funding have a qualitatively negative impact on public schools? And so unfortunately, that can be shown for sure, but you've got to go district by district and say, well, how is this district impacted, or how is this public school impacted? And in some places, obviously that is enormous. That it really sort of makes it hard for them to keep their uniform system going. As you say, they don't have enough students. They've lost so much money. Chester, I talk about it a little bit in the book. Chester, Pennsylvania. They were in receivership with the federal district court and on the verge of bankruptcy because, I'm blanking on the specific amount, but like half, maybe even more than half of their annual budget every year was being written as a check to local charter schools. They could not continue to operate. And part of that's because well, I won't get into the nitty gritty of how they funded it, but in any event, right, that was a serious problem there. In New Jersey, the way that the state had structured charter schools there, let's say, and I'm going to make these numbers up for simplicity, but so let's say the state sends a New Jersey school district $7,000. Well, for every kid who left, Newark Public Schools and went to a charter school, they had to pay $7,500. So it's not just that they're losing that $7,000; they are having to give an additional extra amount. And so these things obviously undermine the quality of the education program, and I argue it is constitutional violation, or at least ought to be. And finally, I mean, I think closer to home for you guys, and one of the reasons, to your credit, I think you're able to beat back that first very expansive voucher that they threw out there in Arizona, was that Nevada had just decided their Supreme Court case and declared their voucher program unconstitutional. Well, the reason why that program is unconstitutional in Nevada is because the Nevada Constitution requires that the very first appropriation and each annual bill must be the appropriation for education. You can never spend money on something else before you've written the check for public education. And really, just as a matter of technicality, to be quite honest, Nevada had botched it up and put the voucher appropriation up there with the public schools. And they said, well, you can't do that, right? We don't have to get into how negatively it affects or it doesn't. Public education must come first. And, not all constitutions are as explicit as Nevada's, but if you look at the sort of intent, they all have that same intent, that the public education system comes first.
Derek, you mentioned charters, and when Espinosa, the decision came out, I noticed that our same friends at the Cato Institute were publishing some blogs about the fact that now potentially there could be religious charters, that the state wouldn't be able to discriminate. I know, my head exploded too. And I'm just wondering how that could play out. I mean, here in Arizona, where I live, like, you can drive around and you can see big churches and there's literally a wall and a charter school. So I don't know if this is like truly the breakdown of the wall between church and state, but it was kind of concerning to me. I'm interested in your thoughts.
Well, I mean, it is, Preston Green has thought about this, a little bit more than I have. But so first of all, I would say when Catholic schools were struggling in DC and the charter movement began to grow there, one of the things that happened was some of those Catholic schools were taken over as charters, but they did not continue as Catholic schools. So it would be fine, so to speak, for a school to convert from a religious school to a non-religious charter. The question you're asking is, well, could they just stay religious? Could the Catholic diocese, for instance, I'm not picking on the Catholic diocese, but could they just become charter schools and offer religious instruction? I think that the charter industry has got to do some fancy language to achieve that goal, which they certainly have shown that they're willing to do, which is to say, they claim to be a public school and it's beneficial for them, right? Saying, well, we're the same as everyone else, give us the same money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when someone has challenged their labor practices or compliance with laws that apply to public schools in regard to teachers, they go, oh, no, we're not public. Or for suspensions and discipline, oh, no, we're not public for those purposes. So they've already shown the capacity to say, well, we're public on one hand when it comes to money, but we want you to treat us private on the other ways. I don't think you can do that dance quite so easily if what you want to say is we're a religious school and a public school at the same time. I don't see how you can make that argument. I think what Cato is saying is, well, there's always sort of the discrimination argument. Well, you shouldn't be able to discriminate against, religious schools. We're not discriminating against religious schools because the only thing we can have are public schools. Maybe the wiggle room that Cato could see is that the Catholic diocese, for instance, could be the EMO, the Education Management Organization that runs the school program for the nonprofit, non-religious person who holds the charter. That, to me, doesn't mean that the Catholic diocese can offer religious instruction at school, but it does mean, I guess, that theoretically, I'm slowly saying this, but theoretically a religious organization could be an EMO, theoretically. But then that, final word on it, it does raise an enormous host of questions about whether they are still a nonprofit charitable organization, if they're getting into the EMO business to run these schools, and are they just running them are they running a profit on them and then using that profit to support their other religious schools? I mean, I think it would raise a lot of concerns, but that never stops anyone nowadays from doing anything. So.
Right. Not in Arizona, that's for sure. They are very creative and tend to get their way. So in terms of schools that are trying to drive profit, I mean.
Oh yeah, I think I put that in the book. I mean, that was the reporting that your all's newspapers did out there was just incredible. On that legislator that, had been doing all this charter legislation forever, and then showed how many $1 million of real estate he held and how much he was bringing in every year, and finally got to be such a big story that he divested himself, but he still continued to collect rent and service charges for another day. I was like, man, it's a good business if you get into it.
That's Arizona. We like to follow the money to see just how things are working. So I think we're almost out of time. This time went very quickly. We did have a couple of questions and comments come in. I'll just read a couple of them. One of our listeners said, public schools are so important to our neighborhoods. They're really the heartbeat and center of the community. It's so important to keep the bond from fraying and keep money from going to private schools and to vouchers. And another viewer said, I find it fascinating that Derek's background is civil rights. It's always been clear to me that privatizations of public schools is directly related to racism and suppressing minority groups, beside the money, of course. So I think we do have a couple of other questions, but I don't know that we'll have time. We'll try to respond directly to them on Facebook. And we do want to say a huge thank you to Derek, and that we very much look forward to your book coming out in the fall. We hope to have a few copies to give away. So we hope you all will keep following us on Facebook and Twitter and on sosaznetwork.org, our website. Beth, do you want to mention a couple of the speakers we have coming up next?
Yeah, so this is our 5th or 6th installment, and we have a few more incredible speakers lined up for July. So tomorrow morning, we're going to have Robin Hiller from Voices of Education in Tucson and Julian Vasquez-Hiller from Kentucky to discuss the teacher crisis and what we can do about it. And then next week, we're going to be talking to G2 Brown from the Journey for Justice Alliance, which is a national network of grassroots community organizations led primarily by Black and Brown people in over 30 U.S. cities. And then lastly, the last week of July, on the 29th, we're going to talk to Superintendent Deborah Dennison and Quincy Nate, and they're going to discuss issues of access, equity, and development for Indigenous students. So lots of different topics. I know there's so much to be to be discussing in terms of public education right now, and we are laser focused on this fight. So thank you for being here with us. And
can I do 120 more seconds?
Sure.
I'm the world's worst. I don't ever let things in, but someone made the comment about racism and vouchers, and one of the things that I know you guys struggle with there, and I sort of struggle with communicating with folks and debating, is the fact that a lot of minority families want vouchers and want charters. And one of the ways I try to talk about that in the book and be entirely respectful to those families is that, and obviously being a white person, of even if I wasn't wealthy, I have that privilege, which is to say, um, America has never once in its history made good on its constitutional obligation to black and brown children. And so those families in those situations have zero reason to believe that things are going to work out for them. And so they are really in a position of living in communities and states that have never served them, and having someone say, well, try something else. And if you've got a multi-hundred-year experience of denial of opportunity, I can't second guess a family that wants to try something else. My only response is that the same people who are holding this alternative out there are the same general people, that maybe, but the same set of motivations or related motivations that have been denying opportunity forever. And so you have to be highly skeptical that this is really about serving those children's needs. And that's not a critique of the decisions that any family or parent has to make that I can't fully appreciate, but it is a critique of the individuals that are putting in the position of having to choose between a state that has never served them and a private system that at least claims it will.
It's a really, really good point.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Derek.
So much more we could talk about. So thank you so, so much.
Thank you.
And we look forward to your book.
Thank you.
And we appreciate your time.
Hopefully we'll see you in person at some point
yes.
in the conference soon.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. We hope you will come to one of our other Speaking of Schools events or join us for one of our many webinars that we offer. You can visit our website to find out about those. And have a great evening, everybody. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.